as we turn again to the Holy Scriptures, may your spirit of wisdom guide us so that we may have ears to hear and eyes to see. Amen. Our reading for today comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 7. Technically the reading was only half of this, but you know me. So, it's a little long, but that's okay. And then you're going to get a lot of names and dates in this sermon, so get ready. There will be a test. All right, starting chapter 7. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 tusks in its mouth, among its teeth, and was told, "Arise and devour many bodies." After this I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots, and there were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion was an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Some of that, I imagine, sounds vaguely familiar, right? That lot of that last chunk gets quoted in different services throughout the year. The book of Daniel is interesting for a lot of different reasons, one of which is it is the only text that we have in the Bible that is not all originally written in either Hebrew or Greek. A huge chunk of Daniel, including this, is actually written in Aramaic, which is another language popular in the area, which gives us some interesting clues as to what we're reading and when it's written and how to go about it. For one thing, Daniel is also sort of fun because there's an older Ugaritic story called Dan-El, right, just without the I, and it's all these court stories of Dan-El working in the courts of the city of Ugarit. And people are probably familiar with some of the other stories of Daniel, right, where he gets brought into the court of the king of Babylon, and they have him do all kinds of stuff. It's very reminiscent of this older story of Daniel and these court stories. Daniel is also fun because it's the earliest example of what we now call apocalyptic literature, which is kind of what we're reading now about these, enormous beasts and strange going-ons that are followed by the reign of God. So, when considering some of this stuff, what we have to look at is contextually what's going on that the author of Daniel 7 is sort of responding to and engrossed in. And while the text places itself in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, that by itself, along with the language, gives us some interesting problems to figure out. First, if it's written in Aramaic, it probably can't be written during the year of Belshazzar, because Aramaic was not used anywhere in this area, largely. There might have been a handful of people in Babylon that used it, but people from Judah were speaking Hebrew, and people in Babylon used Akkadian, and Aramaic doesn't become the default language of this entire area until the Persian Empire controls it all well over a century into the future. So the date for the composition of at least this part of Daniel is usually put somewhere in the 200 to 300s BC, not 600s, which is where, okay, there's another thing. Belshazzar was never a king of Babylon. Okay, we have the Babylonian kings list. We know all of their rulers. Belshazzar was a prince that helped run the city of Babylon while his father, the king Nabonidus, was out in other places around the empire. And so Belshazzar functionally ran the city of Babylon for the better part of 6 or 7 years, but he was never a king. But they have this name that they're running with. So what we're looking at most likely is an author working in a context much later, trying to set this story in a slightly different time. And there's a very good reason for that we'll come back to in a little bit. But that is important for making sense of the stuff that he puts in and the strategy that he's using to communicate these things. He is writing about a time 200 years ago, something like that. Now he says 4 beasts come up out of the waters. Waters always being this symbol of evil and chaos in ancient literature. And man, if you go on the internet, which I would not suggest, and look this up, you get all kinds of fun and exciting ways to understand who these 4 beasts were. But my favorite part is try to look up pictures of them. When I was trying to figure out a cover image to put on here, I settled with the Ghent altarpiece. This is Christ the King, done by Jan van Eyck in the 1430s. But I was originally like, let's put the 4 beasts on there. That would be fun. Okay, 3 of them make sense because you have a bear and a lion and like a leopardy thing. And then the 4th one is always some kind of goofy dinosaur. It is hilarious to look at the ways people have tried to draw it. But these 4 beasts come up out of the water. And scholarly speaking, it's pretty easy to tell who they all sort of represent. The first one is Babylon, right? The bad guy from the perspective of the Hebrews, the ones that they went into exile with. Despite the fact that the Neo-Babylonian Empire was kind of pathetic by the standards of the other empires that were in the area in proximate times, they were a problem for the people writing this book. So, of course, they always get front and center access as the bad guy, right? The second one, the second beast, the bear, is the Median Empire, which is fun because nobody ever talks about Median Empire. The Medes, the Median Empire, starts a little bit to the east of them. They develop very quickly a fairly large empire. They work alongside the Babylonians to destroy the Akkadian Empire, to take down Nineveh, right? The city of Nineveh gets mentioned several times. But so the Babylonians and the Medes worked together to wipe out the Assyrians. And so you have this Median Empire. But the Medes had very, very little interaction with the Hebrew people. So not surprisingly, they don't get a lot of face time. The third beast is the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is the one that defeats Babylon and lets the Hebrew people go. So while it's bad, for a long time they have all kinds of conflicts with the Persians, but Babylon is always treated as worse, and the following one is always looked at worse. The Persians are kind of like, well, we don't like you, but you did some nice stuff for us, so I guess we have to give you some kind of respect in here. So Cyrus the Great is the one who takes the little Persian territory, which is on the edge of the Medes, conquers the Median Empire, and then Babylon, and then kind of keeps going. Cyrus the Great is the one that frees the Hebrews from exile in Babylon, and is the only person mentioned in here, in Isaiah, who is not Hebrew, who is given the title Messiah. Because remember, Messiah is just a common political title in Hebrew. And so he is the only one recognized as a savior of the people for freeing them from Babylon. He's followed by a list of names that you may or may not have heard of: Cambyses, Darius or Darius, Xerxes. These are villains in a lot of movies, right? If you ever seen 300, that's Xerxes. But after a couple hundred years, that empire ends, and you get the fourth beast. The fourth empire, the big bad one in this text, the Greeks. Ooh. Under Alexander the Great, the Greeks roll in and crush the Persians. And in this territory, because when Alexander the Great dies, his empire is broken up into pieces. His generals all fight amongst each other, and you get a group that kind of takes control of Greece that nobody ever talks about because they got crushed by the Romans after not too long. You get the Ptolemies in Egypt, which are famous mostly for eventually having Cleopatra. 15 of them, but we only talk about one for some reason. Every single princess in the Ptolemaic dynasty is named Cleopatra. They just start numbering them after a while. Some of them there's like Cleopatra, Selene, and different stuff, but at any rate, yes, they're all Cleopatras. We don't talk about the rest. And then the Seleucid Empire, which is a really big deal that also nobody talks about for some reason. The Seleucids are this beast. The Seleucids are a series of rulers descended from Seleucus the First, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and they control, surprise, surprise, Judea, and then to the east, the former Persian Empire in this region. And in particular, you notice that one horn comes out and starts saying terrible things, and the whole rest of the story is just is the opposition to this talking horn, okay? That is almost certainly Antiochus the Fourth, depending on how you want to count it, 9th, 10th, or 11th ruler of the Seleucid Empire, who did not like the Jewish people very much. So he wanted to sort of consume, to erase the kind of ethnic distinction between the Jews and the rest of the people in the territory. And so he did a whole bunch of stuff. He banned circumcision. He forced people to work on the Sabbath. He put up Greek idols in the temple in Jerusalem and required sacrifices to be made in the temple to Zeus. And he added a gymnasium onto the temple grounds, which doesn't sound that weird to us. But remember, in the ancient world, at the gym, when you're working out, everybody does it naked. Gymnasium literally means the naked place, by the way. I love the fact that we brought that into English without thinking about it at all. So at the Temple Mount, right outside the temple, there's like hundreds of naked men doing exercises and stuff. And the Jews didn't like that particularly right out front of the temple. So They revolted in 167 BC. This is the Maccabean revolt. This is where Hanukkah comes from. Yay! The Maccabean revolt lasted a bunch of years. They were fighting with Antiochus IV. Eventually, Antiochus is like, I have other things to deal with. And after like 7 years of warfare, some will argue that the Maccabeans won, but I think it's more of to say Antiochus is like, I'll come back and deal with you later. I have bigger fish to fry. And he had to go east and deal with things on the eastern border. So they sort of won before Antiochus died, and they were crushed by his successor. And then a little while later, in 140, the Hasmonean dynasty gets independence, and for about 100 years, they're kind of off and on independent until the Romans conquer them, right? And then they try to revolt a couple of times in 70, and finally you get the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132, after which they're sent everywhere. Okay, that was a lot of history, but like it matters because the story they're trying to tell isn't interested in relaying history as it is, but how they are perceiving it and how they are hoping for it to go. So we kind of need to have some of these moving parts on the table in front of us to assemble what they're trying to do. Like I said earlier, this is the origin that we have in the West, at least, of apocalyptic literature, this kind of grand cosmic battle. And so the author here is taking their literal physical enemies, right? The Babylonians who conquered them in the past, the Medes who would have loved to have conquered them if they had the chance before they were overthrown by the Persians, who also conquered them, and then the Greeks who also conquered them. Those enemies, those physical, literal human enemies, are blown up and abstracted into giant beasts that don't represent a person, but an entire group, right? This entire empire that's ruling over them. And their allies, God in particular then, is shown more like them, right? The Ancient One took his throne, clothing white as snow. The beasts aren't wearing clothing, right? Because they're bears and lions and 10-horned dinosaur things. But this person, dressed in finery, comes down to their aid and overthrows these immense evil beasts that are causing problems for them. And then at the end, once all that evil is destroyed, sets someone on the throne, one like a human being, coming with the cloud of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented, and he was given dominion, and glory, and kingship. They then have an ally on the throne that rules not just them, but everything. So that all these terrible things, these terrible beast empires that have done so many terrible things to them, can't do it again. And God therefore reigns supreme, punishing those who have hurt his beloved and rewarding those who have stayed faithful. But to be clear, and this is a serious issue in contemporary Christianity, apocalyptic literature is not about the future, it's about the present. He is telling a story about Antiochus IV and the Greeks, not something that hasn't happened yet. And trying to, you can always find ways to abstract the people and groups you don't like into these beasts. Go on the internet, look it up, and you will find people saying each of these beasts is contemporary groups out there or countries or something. It's so easy to do. Humans are really, really good at making connections between things, whether or not there's any connections there. This is about Antiochus IV. It is commentary on the present and hopes for the future. We have something like this that we do today still too. We actually have several things. But I'm going to use an example from my own history and childhood and life. When I was a little kid and I was supposed to go to bed, sometimes if my mom went to bed first, my dad would let me stay up late with him and watch Star Trek. All right? And this is the late 80s, early 90s. So we were watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. I don't know if anybody here is big Star Trek fans. I am. Because I think partly of that. And we'd sit up way past my bedtime and watch Star Trek. And I don't know how familiar any of you are with Star Trek, but it takes place a few hundred years in the future, right? Where humans have sort of figured stuff out here on Earth and now are dealing with conflicts with other alien species out in the cosmos, right, out in the galaxy. And as a little kid, I'm like, oh, cool spaceships and lasers, you know. Growing up and rewatching it, because I still love the stuff, you start to realize that, oh, it's not a fun action movie, just a fun action movie. They're talking about what's going on at the time, right? The enemies represent concerns that the contemporary writers have. You know, there's a lot of groups that are sort of representing the USSR in Star Trek. There's groups that represent other empires. There's cultural issues that are going on in the 80s and 90s that get written in as issues that other alien cultures are having that the crew of the Enterprise have to kind of interact with and talk through. And when you spend time watching Star Trek, or you can add in any science fiction or most fantasy books and shows, right? Babylon 5, Farscape, Stargate, I don't know, whatever. What they are doing is taking real things that are going on, questions people have, things people are struggling with, and they are pushing it out into a different space. So it's not us, it's them. Hundreds of years in the future, thousands of light years away, it's a different species or culture or something. So that there's a little bit of distance between you and the issue that's being talked about. So that it's easier to kind of separate yourself from what's going on, take a step back and look at it without being overly reactive to it, because it's not you, and it's not now, and it's not here. It's that level of separation. That is the perfect analogy for apocalyptic literature, all right? And when we look at what the author is doing here, he's taking the concerns of his people, the concerns of the time, dealing with Antiochus, dealing with their history of oppression by the Babylonians, by the Persians, right? All these groups. Here in Daniel, I think it's the next chapter. It's either the one before or the one after. They are looking back at the book of Jeremiah, which is written probably as they're going into exile. And Jeremiah says, you're only going to be there for 70-ish years, depending on how exactly you want to read it. And Daniel reinterprets that to make it hundreds of years, because the author of Daniel is looking at the time frame going, we never really escaped, right? We're still under the thumb of these groups. So for this to be true, we have to rewrite it a little bit to make it make sense. The author is taking the real concerns of his community and saying, it's not us at war with Antiochus, right? It's these huge alien monsters, right? Being written about the time period is now set hundreds of years ago. Okay, it's these huge inhuman monsters that are trying to destroy everything. And God comes down and destroys them all and sets up this perfect kingdom on earth. It is creating that space to then talk about the issues that are going on and to have hope for a way to resolve it. in Star Trek, it's really weird comparing the Bible to Star Trek, but it makes sense. In Star Trek, they go to these places, and at the end of the episode, they may not have fixed everything necessarily, right? But they get some kind of conclusion on the issue. They move on to a different place, or they develop permanent diplomatic relations, or something happens to resolve the conflict in a way that feels satisfying. They're resolving the conflict, saying, God can't let this happen. We are committed to a vision of the world where God has to do something about evil. So God has to come in and figure it out and set us up with a brighter future. I like a lot of sci-fi. I read a lot of books, right? I like movies. The one thing that sets Star Trek apart, and I'm not trying to be an advertisement for it, this is just my own personal point of reference, is that it's the only sci-fi thing that gives a really positive vision of the future. Think about almost anything you've ever seen. If you watch Walking Dead, if you watch, I don't know, any show that's got that sort of fantasy, sci-fi, radically different world feel to it. Every one of them that I have seen in the last 30 years says we screw it all up. Don't they? Except Star Trek. Their vision of the future is one where we kind of put our stuff together. And it's not that there aren't still problems, it's that there's hope. Apocalyptic literature is there to give the people hope, to give a vision of the future where they aren't just left to be eaten by the monsters, but that God comes and stops the monsters. And interestingly enough, this is probably written just before Antiochus IV Epiphanes dies, because it's not really resolved quite yet, but he dies. They win, at least temporarily. They get crushed shortly thereafter, and I feel like if it's written after they get crushed again, then it would reference that, but it doesn't. Everything in this book lines up perfectly if you put the date for its composition to be during that revolt against Antiochus. And then you can read this as them trying to make sense of everything terrible going on in the world without losing hope. That's what apocalyptic literature is about.